Hello and welcome to American Spirits episode 27. How are you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm really tired from having a really hard crash out today from a huge headache. So I'm not going to participate much, as I was saying. So I'll hand it to you in a second for doing the main hosting. But I will be scrolling down the PDF as we read it. And then we have Mr. Quinn, of course. How are you doing?
Passing well. I am sorry to hear of your affliction.
Yeah, it's pretty much gone now, but not feeling too great. So with that, let's transition to the viewing thing, and I will hand it to Ryan to start the first article.
Alrighty, thank you very much, and hopefully you get well soon. So the last couple of streams that we have done has been H.L. Mencken discussing wider society in different spheres. The first stream that we did was we talked about a lot about the law, the religion, like hanging people, fun stuff like that. The second week, last week, we talked a lot about Mencken's ideas about government, the economy, and politicians. Um, this week, we'll start a miniature trend within Mencken's work, where he's going to be talking a lot about history. He has a lot of essays on historical topics. This week is more about like groups of people, so we will have his very famous inflammatory essay against Anglo-Saxons, his criticisms of American culture, his criticisms of the South, his discussion on historians, on revolutions, and on the New Deal. Next week, we will have a discussion on specific people, because H.L. Mencken will cover throughout most of his lifetime various politicians, and he'll also give his thoughts on past politicians as well. So H.L. Mencken lived through the rise of the progressives, so he wrote a lot about Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson. He very famously despised William Jennings Bryan, so that'll be next week. But this week we have more broad phenomena, specifically his Anglo-Saxon essays. So yeah, Mr. Quinn, what were you wanting to say?
Indeed, the WASP enthusiasts are in for some uncomfortable reading this episode. Mencken is less than fulsome of his praise of certain aspects of the American character and the American ethnos. But it's important. One of the themes we have developed over the last 28 or 27 episodes has been what I call the winnowing of American virtue. We started back with Albion Seed, and we tracked, what was so remarkable about these people? What were their strengths? What were their virtues? We're now 150, 200 years forward in history, the essays today being taken primarily from the 1920s and the 1930s. And Mencken is harsh in his criticisms of what may have gone wrong and how the American character may have maldeveloped in that intervening time. So this will be an educational chance for some introspection as Americans about what we ought to recapture and what we ought to eschew.
Yes, and just a couple of things. Mencken's writing style is almost always like a disattached viewer or a spectator who is not in the major political battles. Obviously, he offers you his opinions on the political values. He will tell you what he thinks is idiotic and what he thinks is correct and obvious. But it shouldn't. None of these essays should be taken that H.L. Mencken just really despises like specific or whole groups of people. Well, actually, next week there are specific people he despises, but that's more due to personal reasons. But whenever we talk about like the Anglo-Saxon, whenever we talk about like the Anglo-Saxon, and he is going to get very inflammatory, it's not because he just has like a burning hatred for all things Anglo-Saxon. He really despises anyone descended from that group of people. What he's dealing with is something slightly more political, which is the movement around Anglo-Saxon identity during this time frame, which overlapped almost entirely with the progressives, whom he strongly disliked. So it should be noted that this is within that context. In terms of personal biases on the panel, like the vast majority of my ancestry would be under this Anglo-Saxon group. Mencken himself would be Germanic, mostly, Mencken being a German name, if I recall correctly. So that's I think that's enough background. I can start us off here. This was printed 1924, or actually first printed 1923 in the Evening Sun. When I speak of Anglo-Saxons, of course, I speak inexactly and in the common phrase. Even within the bounds of that phrase, the American of the dominant stock is Anglo-Saxon only partially, for there is probably just as much Celtic blood in his veins as Germanic, and his norm is to be found not south of the Tyne and west of the Severn, but on the two sides of the northern border. Among the first English colonists, there were many men of almost pure Teutonic blood from the east and south of England, and their influence is yet visible in many characteristic American folkways, and certain traditional American ideas, some of them now surviving only in national hypocrisies, and above all in the fundamental peculiarities of the American dialect of English. But their Teutonic blood was early diluted by Celtic strains from Scotland, from the north of Ireland, from Wales, and from the west of England. And today those Americans who are regarded as being most thoroughly Anglo-Saxons, for example, the mountaineers of the Appalachian slopes from Pennsylvania to Georgia, are obviously far more Celtic than Teutonic, not only physically but also mentally. They are leaner and taller than the true English, and far more given to moral obsessions and religious fanaticism. A Methodist revival is not an English phenomenon, it is Welsh. So is the American tendency, marked by every foreign student of our history, to turn all political combats into moral crusades. The English themselves, of course, have been greatly polluted by Scotch, Irish, and Welsh blood during the past 3 centuries, and for years past their government has been largely in the hands of Celts, but though this fact, by making them more Americans, has tended to conceal the difference that I am discussing, it has certainly not sufficed to obliterate it altogether. The English notion of humor remains different from the American notion, and so does the English view of personal liberty. And on the same level of primary ideas, there are many other obvious differences. So if I can pause just for a moment, because this is a slightly longer essay than what we usually go through. We already covered Mencken's work on the American language, and he substantiates most of this, and it's also pretty self-consciously true now that most of those Appalachians and mountaineers and whomever that he's discussing, most of them identify still as Scots-Irish, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a trend, I guess, that was unpopular to note at the time.
Indeed, and I have marked certain differences in the approach to liberty between the English and the Americans in the present day.
Yeah, this is aged well, I think. Also, the humor, notions of humor, English humor is something that I just do not understand. So I will continue. But though I am thus convinced that the American Anglo-Saxon wears a false label and grossly libels both of the great races from which he claims descent, I can imagine no good in trying to change it. Let him call himself whatever he pleases. Whatever he calls himself, it must be plain that the term he uses designates a genuinely distinct and differentiated race, that he is separated definitely in character and habits of thought from the men of all other recognizable strains, that he represents, among the peoples of the earth, almost a special species, and that he runs true to type. The traits that he developed when the first mixture of races took place in colonial days are the traits that he still shows. Despite the vast changes in the material environment, he is almost precisely the same in the way he thinks and acts as his forefathers were. Some of the other great races of men during the past 2 centuries have changed very noticeably, but the American Anglo-Saxon has stuck to his hereditary guns. Moreover, he tends to show much less variation than other races between man and man. No other race, save it be the Chinese, is so thoroughly regimented. The good qualities of this so-called Anglo-Saxon are many, and I am certainly not disposed to question them. But I here pass them over without apology, for he devotes practically the whole of his literature and fully a half of his oral discourse to celebrating them himself, and so there is no danger that they will ever be disregarded. No other man, indeed, is so violently the blowhard, save it be his English kinsman. In this fact lies the first cause of the ridiculous figure he commonly cuts in the eyes of other people. He brags and blusters so incessantly that, if he actually had the combined virtues of Socrates, the Cid, and the 12 Apostles, he would still go beyond the facts, and so appear to be mere bombastus furioso. This habit, I believe, is fundamentally English, but it has been exaggerated in the Americano by his larger admixture of Celtic blood. In late years, in America, it has taken on an almost pathological character, and is to be explained, perhaps, only in terms of the Freudian necromancy. Braggadocio, in the 100% American, "we won the war, it is our duty to lead the world," and so on, is probably no more than a protective mechanism erected to conceal an inescapable sense of inferiority. Brutal. That this inferiority is real must be obvious to any impartial observer. Whenever the Anglo-Saxon, whether of the English or of the American variety, comes into sharp conflict with men of other stocks, he tends to be worsted, or, at best, to be forced back upon extraneous and irrelevant aids to assist him in the struggle. Here, in the United States, his defeat is so palpable that it has filled him with vast alarms and reduced him to seeking succor in grotesque and extravagant devices. In the fine arts, in the sciences, and even in the more complex sorts of business, the children of the later immigrants are running away from the descendants of the early settlers. To call the role of Americans eminent in almost any field of human endeavor above the most elemental is to call a list of strange and often outlandish names. Even the panel of Congress presents a startling example. Of the Americans who have come into notice during the past 50 years as poets, as novelists, as critics, as painters, as sculptors, and in the minor arts, less than half bear Anglo-Saxon names. And in this minority, there are few of pure Anglo-Saxon blood. So in the sciences, so in the higher reaches of engineering and technology, so in philosophy and its branches, so even in industry and agriculture. In those areas where the competition between the new and the old bloodstreams is most sharp and clear-cut, say in New York, in seaboard New England, and in the farming states of the upper Middle West, the defeat of the so-called Anglo-Saxon is overwhelming and unmistakable. Once his predominance everywhere was actual and undisputed. Today, even where he remains superior numerically, it is largely sentimental and illusionary.
I find
The
myself
descendants of the later
repeatedly
immigrant.
I find myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, waiting for Grant Brooks to bust into my house in a rage.
It might happen. American spirits might be commandeered next Monday in a sort of raid, true to the Puritan pirates in Maryland. But something that's worth pointing out here, and actually I think it was Grant Brooks that most consistently pushed this in any of the arguments, discussions, or anything else that I've spoken with him on. He will recognize a lot of this as Mencken is here. Mencken's taking a very critical tone, but it's very clear that like the ethnicity marked on the census, meaning American, is a blend of some sort of Germanic, English, Anglo-Germanic, the Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and what have you. This is, I think it's good to point out, it's very easy to sort of get rage baited by Mencken, if you will, and get angry that he's saying that the pure Anglo-Saxons haven't done well. But almost like he's saying, almost no Americans are pure Anglo-Saxons, especially at
Indeed.
this point in time. Most people have formed an ethnogenesis into like an American synthesis of these Western Europeans.
Indeed. It's also important to not let Mencken's rhetoric, the critical tone he takes, blind us to the underlying truth he's pointing at here, which he says that in all these various areas of the country where Germans and Italians and various other ethnicities have come in and competed with the Anglo-Saxons, they seem to win over and over again. And it's important to look at that and consider the implications of that for how we in the modern day are not similarly displaced, and what it is in this Anglo-Saxon character that leaves us vulnerable to that.
Right. It would be a major mistake to just take the opposite view of Mencken here rather than trying to learn from it.
Yes,
So
exactly.
the reaction is to do the former. So let me see. I think I was at the descendants.
Yes.
The descendants of the later immigrants tend generally to move upward. The descendants of the first settlers, I believe, tend plainly to move downward, mentally, spiritually, and even physically. Civilization is at its lowest mark in the United States, precisely in those areas where the Anglo-Saxon still presumes to rule. He runs the whole South, and in the whole South, there are not as many first-rate men as in many a single city on the mongrel North. Wherever he is still firmly in the saddle, there we look for such pathological phenomena as fundamentalism, prohibition, and Ku Kluxery, and there they flourish. It is not in the northern cities, with their mixed population, that the death rate is highest, and politics most corrupt, and religion nearest to voodooism, and every decent human aspiration suspect. It is in the areas that the recent immigrations have not penetrated, where the purest Anglo-Saxon blood in the world still flows. I could pile up evidences, but they are not necessary. The fact is too plain to be challenged. One testimony will be sufficient. It comes from two inquirers who made an exhaustive survey of a region in southeastern Ohio, where the people are more purely Americans than the rest of the state. Here, gross superstition exercises strong control over the thought and action of a large proportion of the people. Syphilitic and other venereal diseases are common and increasing over whole counties, while in some communities nearly every family is afflicted with inherited or infectious disease. Many cases of incest are known, inbreeding is rife. Imbeciles, feeble-minded, and delinquents are numerous, politics is corrupt, and selling of votes is common, petty crimes abound, the schools have been badly managed and poorly attended. Cases of rape, assault, and robbery are of almost weekly occurrence within 5 minutes' walk of the corporation limits of one of the county seats. While in another county, political control is held by a self-confessed criminal. Alcoholic intemperance is excessive. Gross immorality and its evil results are by no means confined to hill districts, but are extreme also in the towns. As I say, the American of the old stock is not unaware of this steady and of late somewhat rapid deterioration. This gradual loss of his old mastery in the land his ancestors helped to wring from the Indian and the wildcat. He senses it, indeed, very painfully, and, as if in despair of arresting it in fact, makes desperate efforts to dispose of it by denial and concealment. These efforts often take grotesque and extravagant forms. Laws are passed to hobble and cage the citizen of newer stocks in 100 fantastic ways. It is made difficult and socially dangerous for him to teach his children the speech of his fathers, or to maintain the cultural attitudes that he has inherited from them. Every divergence from the norm of the low-caste Anglo-Saxon is treated as an attentat against the Commonwealth and punished with eager ferocity.
It's interesting. It is
It's
a
worth pointing out
common.
here.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's worth pointing out here. Everything that Mencken is criticizing so far is among the lower class of the Anglo-Saxons. He's not talked about the WASP aristocracy that the online right likes to talk about, especially during this time period that he's writing. But yes, Mr. Quinn, what were you saying?
His ire is directed at what is colloquially known as the white trash of this era. The other thing that's interesting going on here is that today the right will often point back to this era of the 1920s before or after the gates of Ellis Island were slammed shut and America adopted conscious policies to force the large immigrant population to assimilate. And we look back at that with nostalgic eyes now. But here in the actual time it was happening, Mencken seems to take a critical attitude towards it. What do you make of that?
Sorry, I inhaled part of my water. So I will say, the mainline libertarian historiography of this Actually, give me a moment.
All right.
The
I will.
mainline libertarian historiography of this period is that the progressive era brought about like a sort of centralization of the state, which allowed the state to wipe out these other populations that were within inside the United States that were not, say, speaking English, were not derived from the British Isles, the Netherlands, or Scandinavia. Um, in fact, it was quite a very popular fact about 7 or 8 years ago that the once upon a time the second most spoken language in the United States was German
Mhm.
and not Spanish. And that resonated with quite a few people for reasons that should be obvious. I think that a lot, this is my personal speculation, but I think I get to indulge in a little bit of sociology on these streams. Um, I think a lot of our modern sort of existential crises has conditioned us to look back in history with that sort of same urgency. Um, were the Germans in the Midwest going to completely destroy the country, tear it apart, and what have you? Probably not. Were they completely redefining America, what it means to be American, any of these other things? It's disputable in terms of like how long it took to be considered a citizen of the United States, but they were still granted citizenship even under the most stringent of laws advocated by the other side. Um, it's very clear that these other Europe, even the Italians at this point, are the only sort of right-leaning populations, if I understand correctly, in places like New Jersey and New York.
Mhm.
Um, so it's easy for a lot of the online right, I think, to look at our current situation and then project that backwards into the United States of the 1920s and the 1910s, that was seeing unprecedented amounts of immigrants coming in from Central and Southern Europe. But I don't I don't actually think it's so existential at this point, especially if you look at what they have become. They are obviously different. Um, Many of them obviously are Roman Catholic and not Protestant. That's the major sticking point for a lot of the modern online right or modern right historians on this era.
Mhm.
But they very clearly are not trying to destroy the country. If anything, all of their actions seem to point to preserving the country. So that's my opinion. But Mr. Quinn, what was yours?
I don't profess to have one. I was just, when I read this the first time, I was somewhat taken aback at Mencken castigating these, what he characterizes as attempts to wipe out the immigrants' culture, what a modern writers would call forcing assimilation, as some sort of injustice. He's very sympathetic to them, and I was just trying to tease out where that's coming from.
Right, and I do think that it's purely because of what side was advocating it and by what means at the time.
Ha!
So
All
I
right.
I don't think that you could I don't think you could transplant Mencken into the modern day and expect him to have the same exact reaction
That
towards
is
assimilation,
a
immigration, and what have you.
fascinating mental image. He's
I
back,
mean,
but with Mencken.
yes, we're going to take we're going to take the resurrected H.L. Mencken and tour him around Minneapolis, various neighborhoods in New York City, St. Louis, perhaps. I don't think he would. I think the underlying principle would lead him to conclude different. Would lead him to different conclusions on this idea of assimilation, or perhaps a different solution than assimilation. So
As long as we're paused
I'll
here, the other
continue.
thing that
Yeah, yeah.
strikes me about what we've read so far is how a lot of the themes Mencken touches on this degeneration of the low class Anglo-Saxon and this encroaching competition from foreign peoples is very much mirrored in the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. The Lovecraft was writing at the exact same time, and Mencken and Lovecraft seem to be very much on the same wavelength, noticing these things and being worried about them.
Yeah, it was definitely in the air. Even a lot of the popular novels from this decade in particular note the same things with varying degrees of sympathy. But um, I will say he's talking about the Anglo-Saxon being brutally outcompeted, but I think it's pretty clear that that's like a rhetorical overstatement that he's
Oh yeah,
speaking
he's
at, because it's
definitely over
very
egging the
clearly in
pudding
the
on that.
modern day.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So once again, don't get rage baited. Just because he's not speaking of this like H.P. Lovecraft with his apocalyptic tone doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that they don't have the same concerns.
Max does love
So
an
I will
apocalyptic tone.
I'll continue on. It so happens that I myself, an Anglo-Saxon, one of far purer blood indeed than most of the half-bleached Celts who pass under the name in the United States and England. I am in part Angle and in part Saxon, and what else I am is safely white, Nordic, Protestant, and blonde. Thus I feel free, without risk of venturing into bad taste, to regard frankly the soi disant Anglo-Saxon of this incomparable republic and his rather less dubious cousins of the motherland. How do the two appear to me, after years spent largely in accumulating their disfavor? What are the characters that I discern most clearly in the so-called Anglo-Saxon type of man? I may answer at once that two stick out above all others. One in his curious and apparently incurable incompetence, his congenital inability to do any difficult thing easily and well, whether it be isolating a bacillus or writing a sonata. The other is his astounding susceptibility to fears and alarms. In short, his hereditary cowardice. To accuse so enterprising and successful a race of cowardice, of course, is to risk immediate derision. Nevertheless, I believe that a fair-minded examination of its history will bear me out. 9/10 of the great feats of daring do that its sucklings are taught to venerate in school, that is, its feats as a race, not the isolated exploits of its extraordinary individuals, most of them at least partly of other stocks, have been wholly lacking in even the most elementary gallantry. Consider, for example, the events attending the extension of the two great empires, English and American. Did either movement evoke any genuine courage and resolution? The answer is plainly no. Both empires were built up primarily by swindling and butchering unarmed savages, and after that by robbing weak and friendless nations. Neither produced a hero above the average run of those in the movies, neither exposed the folks at home to any serious danger of reprisal. Almost always, indeed, mercenaries have done the Anglo-Saxons' fighting for him, a high testimony to his common sense, but scarcely flattering, I fear, to the truculence he boasts of. The British Empire was won mainly by Irishmen, Scotchmen, and native allies, and the American Empire, at least in large part, by Frenchmen and Spaniards. Moreover, neither great enterprise cost an appreciable amount of blood, neither presented grave and dreadful risks, neither exposed the conqueror to the slightest danger of being made the conquered. The British won most of their vast dominions without having to stand up in a single battle against a civilized and formidable foe, and the Americanos won their continent at the expense of a few dozen puerile skirmishes with savages. The total cost of conquering the whole area from Plymouth Rock to the Golden Gate and from Lake George to the Everglades including even the cost of driving out the French, Dutch, English, and Spaniards, was less than the cost of defending Verdun. So far as I can make out, there is no record in history of any Anglo-Saxon nation entering upon any great war without allies. The French have done it, the Dutch have done it, the Germans have done it, the Japs have done it, and even such inferior nations as the Danes, the Spaniards, the Boers, and the Greeks have done it, but never the English or Americans. Can you imagine if the United States resolutely facing a war in which the odds against it were as huge as they were against Spain in 1898? The facts of history are wholly against any such fancy. The Anglo-Saxon always tries to take a gang with him when he goes into battle. And even when he has it behind him, he is very uneasy and prone to fall into panic at the first threat of genuine danger. Here I put an unimpeachably Anglo-Saxon witness on the stand, to wit, the late Charles W. Eliot. I find him saying, in an article quoted with approbation by the Congressional Record, that during the Revolutionary War, the colonists now hymned so eloquently in the school books, quote, fell in a condition of despondency, from which nothing but the steadfastness of Washington and the Continental Army and the aid from France saved them. And that, quote, when the War of 1812 brought grave losses, a considerable portion of the population experienced a moral collapse, from which they were rescued only by the exertions of a few thoroughly patriotic statesmen and the exploits of 3 or 4 American frigates on the seas, to say nothing of an enterprising Corsican gentleman, Bonaparte by name. So, this is just a pause here. Everything that we have been reading from Mencken is about tearing down idols, things that are held in too high a regard. Mencken always trends in the direction of tearing down anything that has been overpuffed. So
Indeed.
this is, I think, very relevant to the online right now, because the online right really likes to indulge in mythology, regardless of factual statements, and they also like to indulge in a lot of the bravado that Mencken is talking about. Most recently, at the time of recording, you just have to look at the reaction to America invading Venezuela. It's the exact kind of war that Mencken is talking about here, though debatable as to whether it's in the interests of America even as a nation, but it's the exact same idea. You would never find America defending itself on the other side of such an exchange. It's always the initiator, where the victory is surely won. It's not existential. So, yes,
Indeed.
Mr. Quinn.
Mencken's point could be more charitably framed as Americans or Anglo-Saxons aren't idiots. Of course, the Greeks, the Germans, the Japanese, sure, they fought valiantly and gallantly against overwhelming odds, and in all the relevant cases, they lost. The Americans and the English, you could certainly say, are simply more canny. And if Mencken chooses to cast moral opprobrium on this, I think he does it as a rhetorical point. I don't think you can seriously suggest that the United States should go looking for losing wars. We have enough success with that, even when we bring a gang, a coalition of the willing, if you will, to bear. So, yeah, take it for what it.
Yeah, that's not the right. Yeah, that's not what he's trying to conclude here. What he's trying to conclude is very much in this last sentence, to say nothing of an enterprising Corsican gentleman, Bonaparte by name. It's that the Americans will do this, and the British as well, and then they will very promptly forget about their coalition of the willing, which seems to very much be the case in the modern day. So, I'll continue. In both of these wars, the Americans had enormous and obvious advantages, in terrain, in allies, and in men. Nevertheless, they fought, in the main, very badly, and from the first shot to the last, a majority of them stood in favor of making peace on almost any terms. Just to pause, we talked about this from the side against making peace on any terms when we covered Thomas Paine, back when maybe that seemed a little bit strange as to why any right-winger would cover Thomas Paine, but hopefully that's seeming a little bit more obvious now. I'll continue. The Mexican and Spanish wars I pass over as perhaps too obscenely ungallant to be discussed at all. Of the former, U.S. Grant, who fought in it, said that it was, quote, the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. Who remembers that, during the Spanish War, the whole Atlantic coast trembled in fear of the Spaniards' feeble fleet, that all New England had hysterics over every time a strange coal barge was sighted on the skyline, that the safe deposit boxes of Boston were emptied, and their contents transferred to Worcester, and that the Navy had to organize a patrol to save the coast towns from depopulation. Perhaps those Reds, atheists, and pro-Germans remember it, who also remember that during World War I, the entire country went wild with fear of an enemy who, without the aid of divine intervention, obviously could not strike it a blow at all, and that the great moral victory was gained at last with the assistance of 21 allies and at odds of 8-1. But the American Civil War remains. Does it indeed? The almost unanimous opinion of the North in 1861 was that it would be over after a few small battles. The first soldiers were actually enlisted for but 3 months. When later on it turned unexpectedly into a severe struggle, recruits had to be driven to the front by force, and the only Northerners remaining in favor of going on were Abraham Lincoln, a few ambitious generals, and the profiteers. I turn to Dr. Eliot again. Quote, "In the closing year of the war," he says, "large portions of the Democratic Party in the North and of the Republican Party advocated surrender to the Confederacy, so downhearted were they. Downhearted at odds of 3-1. The South was plainly more gallant, but even the gallantry of the South was largely illusory. The Confederate leaders, when the war began, adopted at once the traditional Anglo-Saxon device of seeking allies. They tried and expected to get the aid of England, and they actually came very near succeeding. When hopes in that direction began to fade, i.e., when England concluded that tackling the North would be dangerous, the common people of the Confederacy threw up the sponge, and so the catastrophe, when it came at last, was mainly internal. The South failed to bring the quaking North to a standstill because, to borrow a phrase that Dr. Eliot uses in another connection, it, quote, experienced a moral collapse of unprecedented depth and duration. Even so early as Shiloh, indeed, many Confederate regiments were already refusing to fight. So this is what we might call foreshadowing for this week and next week. Mencken really likes the antebellum South. So you can take that as proof that Mencken is not just blindly hateful of Anglo-Saxons, because that is the nation state, if ever there was one, to represent that group. I will continue. This reluctance for desperate chances and hard odds, so obvious in the military record of the English-speaking nations, is also conspicuous in times of peace. What a man of another and superior stock almost always notices, living among so-called Anglo-Saxons, is A, their incapacity for prevailing in fair rivalry, either in trade, in the fine arts, or in what is called learning, in brief, their general incompetence, and B, their invariable effort to make up for this incapacity by putting some inequitable burden upon their rivals, usually by force. The Frenchman, I believe, is the worst of chauvinists, but once he admits a foreigner to his country, he at least treats the foreigner fairly, and does not try to penalize him absurdly for his mere foreignness. The Anglo-Saxon American is always trying to do it. His history is a history of recurrent outbreaks of blind rage against peoples who have begun to worst him. Such movements would be inconceivable in an efficient and genuinely self-confident people, wholly assured of their superiority. And they would be equally inconceivable in a truly gallant and courageous people, disdaining unfair advantages and overwhelming odds. Theoretically launched against some imaginary inferiority in the non-Anglo-Saxon man, either as patriot, as Democrat, or as Christian, they actually launched at his general superiority, his greater fitness to survive in the national environment. The effort is always to penalize him for winning in fair fight, to handicap him in such a manner that he will sink to the general level of the Anglo-Saxon population, and, if possible, even below it. Such devices, of course, never have the countenance of the Anglo-Saxon minority that is authentically superior, and hence self-confident and tolerant. But that minority is pathetically small, and it tends steadily to grow smaller and feebler. The communal laws and the communal mores are made by the folk, and they offer all the proof that is necessary, not only of its general inferiority, but also of its alarmed awareness of that inferiority. The normal American of the pure-blooded majority goes to rest every night with an uneasy feeling that there is a burglar under the bed, and he gets up every morning with a sickening fear that his underwear has been stolen. The Anglo-Saxon of the great herd is, in many important respects, the least civilized of white men and the least capable of true civilization. His political ideas are crude and shallow. he is almost wholly devoid of aesthetic feeling. The most elementary facts about the visible universe alarm him and incite him to put them down. Educate him, make a professor of him, teach him how to express his soul, and he still remains palpably third-rate. He fears ideas almost more cravenly than he fears men. His blood, I believe, is running thin. Perhaps it was not much to boast of at the start, in order that he may exercise any functions above those of a trader, a pedagogue, or a mob orator. It needs the stimulus of other and less exhausted strains. The fact that they increase is the best hope of civilization in America. They shake the old race out of its spiritual lethargy and introduce it to disquiet and experiment. They make for a free play of ideas. In opposing the process, whether in politics, in letters, or in the ages-long struggle towards the truth, the prophets of Anglo-Saxon purity and tradition only make themselves ridiculous. So, this is Mencken's invective, if you will, against the Anglo-Saxons, and he tells you the purpose at the very end there, that last paragraph. Very clearly, he views it as having become lethargic and artificial.
It certainly
Which
is invective.
is very cyclical.
Yes.
Yes. So it's Mencken, like most sensible people, holds the cyclical idea that if you protect something long enough, if you shield it from the outside world, if you prevent it from being punched a little, it will just atrophy. And that's the point that he's making here about the Anglo-Saxons at the 1920s. And it's, of course, worth pointing out that also many of these Anglo-Saxons, aside from the Southern and Eastern European socialists that were imported, many of these Anglo-Saxons tended to also support the political left at the time, so it's something that cuts both ways. A lot of the immigrants did, but so did a lot of these Anglo-Saxon or these English-derived. The Socialist Party in the 1912 election did not get, 8% of the vote or something, purely among Serbians and Italians. So
Eugene
it's just something to
Debs,
keep in mind.
famous Serbian name.
yeah, Sinclair, famously Italian. So, the next on our list, I believe, is the next one here on the screen, page 178, American Culture.
Yep.
Mr. Quinn, could you please take this?
I will take it. This from the Yale Review, June 1920. The capital defect in the culture of these states is the lack of civilized aristocracy, secure in its position, animated by an intelligent curiosity, skeptical of all facile generations, superior to the sentimentality of the mob, and delighting in the battle of ideas for its own sake. The word I use, despite the qualifying adjective, has got itself meanings, of course, that I by no means intend to convey. Any mention of an aristocracy to a public fed upon democratic fustian is bound to bring up images of stockbrokers' wives lolling obscenely in opera boxes, or of haughty Englishmen slaughtering whole generations of grouse in an inordinate and incomprehensible manner, or of bogus counts coming over to work their magic upon the daughters of breakfast food and bathtub kings. This misconception belongs to the general American tradition. Its depth and extent are constantly revealed by the naive assumption that the so-called fashionable folk of the large cities, chiefly wealthy industrials in the interior decorator and country club stage of culture, constitute an aristocracy, and by scarcely less remarkable assumption that the peerage of England is identical with the gentry, that is, that such men as Lord Northcliffe, Lord Riddell, or even Lord Reading were English gentlemen. Here, as always, the worshipper is the father of the gods, and no less when they are evil than when they are benign. The inferior man must find himself superiors, that he may marvel at his political equality with them. And in the absence of recognizable superiors de facto, he creates superiors de jure. The sublime principle of one man, one vote must be translated into terms of dollars, diamonds, fashionable intelligence. Equality of all men before the law must have clear and dramatic proofs. Sometimes, perhaps, the thing goes further and is more subtle. The inferior man needs an aristocracy to demonstrate not only his mere equality, but also his actual superiority. The society columns in the newspapers may have some such origin. They may visualize once more the accomplished journalist's understanding of the mob mind that he plays upon so skillfully as upon some immense and cacophonous organ, always going fortissimo, with the inferior man and his wife see in the sinister revels of those Brummagem first families, I suspect is often a massive witness to their own higher rectitude. In brief, to their firmer grasp upon the immutable axioms of Christian virtue, the one sound boast of the nether 9/10 of humanity in every land under the cross. This bugaboo aristocracy is actually bogus, and the evidence of its bogusness lies in the fact that it is insecure. One gets into it only onerously, but out of it very easily. Entrance is effected by dint of a long and bitter struggle, and the chief incidents of that struggle are almost intolerable humiliations. The aspirant must school and steel himself to sniffs and sneers. He must see the door slammed upon him 100 times before ever it is thrown open to him. To get in at all, he must show a talent for abasement, and abasement makes him timorous. Worse, that timorousness is not cured when it succeeds at last. On the contrary, it is made even more tremulous, for what he faces within the gates is a scheme of things made up almost wholly of harsh and often unintelligible taboos, and the penalty for violating even the least of them is swift and disastrous. He must exhibit exactly the right social habits, appetites, and prejudices, public and private. He must harbor exactly the right enthusiasms and indignations. He must have a hearty taste for exactly the right sports and games. His attitude towards the fine arts must be properly tolerant and yet not a shade too eager. He must read and the like exactly the right books, pamphlets, and public journals. He must put up at the right hotels when he travels. His wife must patronize the right millineries. He himself must stick to the right haberdashery. He must live in the right neighborhood. He must even embrace the right doctrines of religion. It would ruin him, for all society column purposes, to move to Union Hill, New Jersey, or to drink coffee from his saucer, or marry a chambermaid with a gold tooth, or to join the Seventh-day Adventists. Within the boundaries of his curious order, he is worse fettered than a monk in a cell. Its obscure conception of propriety, its nebulous notion of this or that is honorable, hampers him in every direction and very narrowly. What he resigns when he enters, even when he makes his first deprecating knock at the door, is every right to attack the ideas that happen to prevail within. Such as they are, he must accept them without question, and as they shift and change, he must shift and change with them, silently and quickly. Obviously, that order cannot constitute a genuine aristocracy in any rational sense. A genuine aristocracy is grounded upon very much different principles. Its first and most salient character is its interior security, and the chief visible evidence of that security is the freedom that goes with it. Not only freedom in act, the divine right of the aristocrat to do what he damn well pleases, so long as he does not violate the primary guarantees and obligations of his class, but also, and more importantly, freedom in thought, the liberty to try and err, the right to be his own man. It is the instinct of a true aristocracy not to punish eccentricity by expulsion, but to throw a mantle of protection about it, to safeguard it from the suspicions and resentments of the lower orders. Those lower orders are inert, timid, inhospitable to ideas, hostile to changes, and faithful to a few maudlin superstitions. All progress goes on the higher levels. It is there that salient personalities, made secure by artificial immunities, may oscillate widely from the normal track. It is within that entrenched fold, out of reach of the immemorial certainties of the mob that the extraordinary men of the lower orders may find their city of refuge and breathe clear air. This indeed is at once the hallmark and the justification of a genuine aristocracy, that it is beyond responsibility to the general masses of men, and hence superior both to their degraded longings and their no less degraded aversions. It is nothing if it is not autonomous, curious, venturesome, courageous, and everything if it is. It is the custodian of the qualities that make for change and experiment. It is the class that organizes danger to the service of the race. It pays for its high prerogatives by standing in the forefront of the fray. No such aristocracy, must be plain, is now on view in the United States. The makings of one were visible in Virginia of the 18th century, but with Jefferson and Washington, the promise died. In New England, it seems to me, there was never anything of the sort, either in being or in nascency. There was only a theocracy that degenerated very quickly into a plutocracy on the one hand and a caste of sterile pedants on the other. The passion for God splitting into a lust for dollars and a weakness for mere words. Despite the common notion to the contrary, a notion generated by confusing literacy with intelligence, the New England of the great days never showed any genuine enthusiasm for ideas. It began its history as a slaughterhouse of ideas, and today is not easily distinguishable from a cold storage plant. Its celebrated adventures in mysticism, once apparently so bold and significant, are now seen to have been little more than elaborate hocus pocus. Respectable Unitarians shocking the peasantry and searing the horned cattle in the fields by masquerading in the robes of Rosicrucians. The notions that it embraced in those austere, far-off days were stale, and when it had finished with them, they were dead. So in politics, since the Civil War, it has produced fewer political ideas, as political ideas run in the Republic, than any average county in Kansas or Nebraska. Appomattox seemed to be a victory for New England idealism. It was actually a victory for New England plutocracy, and that plutocracy has dominated thought above the Housatonic ever since. A sect of professional idealists has so far dwindled that when it ceased to be of any importance, even as opposition. When the plutocracy is challenged now, it is challenged by the proletariat. Well,
here, should we pause here just quickly, because I don't want to let the thread escape us.
By all means.
Because what we're talking about here, I don't think really applies to like traditional heritage Americans, we might call them. Even though they look like a lot of what Mencken is talking about being in the upper classes, the faux aristocracy that he's about to elaborate even further upon. There are places that you can go to in the United States, social groups that you can come across, organizations that you can enter into that severely restrict where you eat, what you buy, who you buy from, what ideas that you're allowed to have. Like this sounds almost very normie-con for me to say, but this is sort of like the same sociology that he's attacking back in the the 1920s? Yeah, early 1920s. Still exists today, but I think a lot of people on the right recognize that this is not an aristocracy much clearer, because the pathologies of the sociologies of this group of people are not on their political side anymore. We can see it for what it is, perhaps because it's politically convenient, but very clearly these behaviors, this faux aristocracy, still exists with radically different people. It's just not really on our side, except for a few exceptions.
Indeed, and as Mencken castigates this bogus aristocracy and describes its antithesis, the genuine aristocracy, my mind is filled with an irremovable vision of Christopher Sandbach silently nodding.
Yeah, right. And we'll talk about that soon when we get to Mencken on the South. But it's worth pointing out that if you want an actual aristocracy, it has to be developed. And if you want to develop an actual aristocracy, you have to have like the conditions for one to develop. It's
Namely
pretty clear
secured.
that with the present state of the country, yeah, with the present state of the country, at least to me, I don't think that we have such conditions, which
No,
is
it's impossible.
maybe why a lot of these, yeah, a lot of these online right-wing sort of monastic ideas to just go out and make an aristocracy seem a little bit foolish. It's not the correct response to hearing this from someone like Mencken. Don't just go out and try to make your own homemade aristocracy, because it's not one and it won't work.
No, the social conditions
It will
for
take
its
time.
existence are not extant.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
what is on view in New England is on view in all other parts of the nation, sometimes with ameliorations, but usually with the colors merely exaggerated. One beholds, sweeping the eye over the land, is a culture that, like the national literature, is in three layers. The plutocracy on top, a vast mass of undifferentiated human blanks bossed by demagogues at the bottom, and a forlorn intelligentsia grasping out a precarious life between. I need not set out at any length, I hope, the intellectual deficiencies of the plutocracy, its utter failure to show anything even remotely resembling the makings of an aristocracy. It is badly educated. It is stupid. It is full of low caste superstitions and indignations. It is without decent traditions or informing vision. Above all, it is extraordinarily lacking in the most elemental independence and courage. Out of this class comes the grotesque, fashionable society of our big towns already described. It shows all the stigmata of inferiority, moral certainty, cruelty, suspicion of ideas, fear. Never does it function more revealingly than in the recurrent pogroms against radicalism, i.e., against humorless persons who, like Andrew Jackson, take the platitudes of democracy seriously. And what is the theory at the bottom of all these proceedings? So far, it can be reduced to comprehensible terms. As it can be reduced to comprehensible terms, it is much less a theory than a fear, a shivering, idiotic, discreditable fear of a mere banshee, an overpowering, paralyzing dread that some extra eloquent red, permitted to emit his balderdash unwhipped, may eventually convert a couple of courageous men, and that the courageous men, filled with indignation against the plutocracy, may take to the high road, burn down a nail factory or two, and slit the throat of some virtuous profiteer. Obviously, as it is out of reason to look for any hospitality to ideas in a class so extravagantly fearful of even the most palpably absurd of them, its philosophy is firmly grounded upon the thesis that the existing order must stand forever free from attack, and not only from attack, but also from mere academic criticism. And its ethics are as firmly grounded upon the thesis that every attempt at any criticism is proof of a moral turpitude. Within its own ranks, protected by what may be regarded as the privilege of the order, there is nothing to take the place of this criticism. In other countries, the plutocracy has often produced men of reflective and analytical habit, eager to rationalize its instincts and bring it into some sort of relationship with the mainstreams of human thought. The case of David Ricardo at once comes to mind, and there have been many others: John Bright, Richard Cobden, George Grote. But in the United States, no such phenomenon has been visible. Nor has the plutocracy ever fostered an inquiring spirit among its intellectual valets and footmen, which is to say, among the gentlemen who compose headlines and leading articles for its newspapers. What chiefly distinguishes the daily press of the United States from the press of all other countries pretending to culture is not its lack of truthfulness, or even its lack of dignity and honor, for these deficiencies are common to newspapers everywhere, but its incurable fear of ideas, its constant effort to evade the discussion of fundamentals by translating all issues into a few elemental fears, its incessant reduction of all reflection to mere emotion. It is, in the true sense, never well informed. It is seldom intelligent, save in the arts of the mob master. It is never courageously honest. Held harshly to a rigid correctness of opinion, it sinks rapidly into formalism and feebleness. Its yellow section is perhaps the best section, for there the only vestige of the old free journalist survives. In the more respectable papers, one finds only a timid and petulant animosity to all questioning of the existing order, however urbane and sincere, a pervasive and ill-concealed dread that the mob now heated up against the orthodox hobgoblins may suddenly begin to unearth hobgoblins of its own and so run amok. For it is upon the emotions of the mob, of course, that the whole comedy is played. Theoretically, the mob is the repository of all wisdom and virtue. Actually, it is the ultimate source of all political power. Even the plutocracy cannot make war upon it openly, or forget the least of its weaknesses. The business of keeping it in order must be done discreetly, warily, with delicate technique. In the main, that business consists of keeping alive its deep-seated fears, of strange faces, of unfamiliar ideas, of unhackneyed gestures, of untested liberties and responsibilities. The one permanent emotion of the inferior man, as of all simpler mammals, is fear. Fear of the unknown, the complex, the inexplicable. What he wants beyond everything else is security. His instincts incline him toward a society so organized that it will protect him at all hazards, and not only against perils to his hide, but also against assaults upon his mind, against the need to grapple with unaccustomed problems, to weigh ideas, to think things out for himself, to scrutinize the platitudes upon which his everyday thinking is based.
That's a pretty strong counter argument against meme thinking.
Indeed.
It's very hard to add much to this, just because I would be beating a dead horse. But once again, it's worth reiterating that most of what we have for ruling in the United States is a mob, and it comes with all the downsides of being ruled by a mob. Most eminently, especially to a scholar like Mencken, who studied someone like Nietzsche, is that we will be ruled by people who are just inferior, at least in this view. And he explains what inferiority actually is, and it's being ruled by fear, metaphysically and physically. So, something good to keep in mind. Alrighty. Next, unless Mr. Quinn, you had anything else?
Nope. I think we have mined that shaft to the very bottom.
Fantastic. So next in the Chrestomathy, Mencken has a whole chapter on the South. So he's already betrayed some sympathies to the South, but he puts that to rest almost immediately with a lot of his own arguments against the South. Once again, if you do not understand who Mencken is, why he is writing, it is because he is a critic and he will criticize. That is his job. That's what he does. It's his art form. So we have here the Confederate Mind. My voice is finally recovered to read this one. It's going to be
and just in
fun.
time.
Yes. We have here the Confederate Mind from the Smart Set, October 1921. Many of the curious phenomena which engage and delight the psychologists in the late Confederate States are probably explicable as effects of a tradition of truculence
I'm sorry, are we not
operating upon a
doing...
population.
I thought we were doing
did I get the wrong
calamity
one?
mathematics.
Whoops.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's Appomattox, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I got the wrong one.
I was going to say, this one was not in the reading.
Retry that. No, sorry. I had that written down for some reason on my desk. The Calamity at Appomattox. That was a false alarm. From the American Mercury, September 1930. No American historian, so far as I know, has ever tried to work out the probable consequences if Grant instead of Lee had been on the hotspot at Appomattox. How long would the victorious Confederacy have endured? Could it have surmounted the difficulties inherent in the doctrine of states' rights, so often inconvenient and even paralyzing to it during the war? Could it have remedied its plain economic deficiencies and become a self-sustaining nation? How would it have protected itself against such war heroes as Beauregard and Longstreet, Joe Wheeler and Nathan B. Forrest? And what would have been its relations to the United States, socially, economically, spiritually, and politically? I am inclined, on all these counts, to be optimistic. The chief evils in the federal victory lay in the fact, from which we still suffer abominably, that it was a victory of what we now call Babbitts over what used to be called gentlemen. I am not arguing here, of course, that the whole Confederate army was composed of gentlemen. On the contrary, it was chiefly made up, like the Federal army, of innocent and unwashed peasants, and not a few of them got into its corps of officers. But the impulse behind it, as everyone knows, was essentially aristocratic, and that aristocratic impulse would have fashioned the Confederacy if the fortunes of war had run the other way. Whatever the defects of the new Commonwealth below the Potomac, it would have at least been a Commonwealth founded upon a concept of human inequality, and with a superior minority at the helm. It might not have produced any more Washingtons, Madisons, Jeffersons, Calhouns, and Randolphs of Roanoke, but it would certainly not have yielded itself to Heflins, Caraways, Bilbos, and Tillmans.
Tillman is a
The
fun
rise of
figure
such
for chat to
boundary.
look up on their own time.
Yeah, that's true. The rise of such bounders was a natural and inevitable consequence of the military disaster. That disaster left the southern gentry deflated and almost helpless. Thousands of the best young men among them had been killed, and thousands of those who survived came north. They commonly did well in the north and were good citizens. My own native town of Baltimore was greatly enriched by their immigration, both culturally and materially. If it is less corrupt today than the other large American cities, then the credit belongs largely to Virginians, many of whom arrived with no baggage save good manners and empty bellies. Back home, they were sorely missed. First, the carpetbaggers ravaged the land, and then it fell into the hands of the native white trash, already so poor that war and Reconstruction could not make them any poorer. When things began to improve, they seized upon whatever was seizable, and their heirs and assigns, now poor no longer, hold it to this day. A raw plutocracy owns and operates the New South, with no challenge save from the proletariat, white and black, that is still 3/4 peasantry and hence too stupid to be dangerous. The aristocracy is almost extinct, at least as a force in government. It may survive in backwaters and on puerile levels, but of the men who run the South today and represented at Washington, not 5% by any Southern standard are gentlemen. If the war had gone with the Confederates, no such vermin would be in the saddle, nor would there be any sign below the Potomac of their chief contributions to American culture: Ku Kluxery, political ecclesiasticism, nigger baiting, and the most homicidal variety of wowerism. Such things might have arisen in America. Yeah, wower. I can't believe he went there. Such things might have arisen in America, but they would not have arisen in the South. The old aristocracy, however degenerate it might have become, would have at least retained sufficient decency to see to that. New Orleans today would still be a highly charming and civilized, if perhaps somewhat zymotic, city, with a touch of Paris and another of Port Said. Charleston, which even now sprouts lady authors, would also sprout political philosophers. The University of Virginia would be what Jefferson intended it to be, and no shouting Methodist would haunt its campus. Richmond would be not the dull suburb of nothing that it is now, but a beautiful and consoling second-rate capital comparable to Budapest, Brussels, Stockholm, or The Hague. And all of us with the Middle West pumping its revolting silo juices into the That's a little bit more literal in the modern day. Sorry,
Silo
I'll
juices.
start from the beginning there. Yeah, that's your new word for corn
For
subsidies and
ethanol.
ethanol.
Yep.
Anyone listening? Yeah, right. And all of us, with the Middle West pumping its revolting silo juices into the East and West alike, would be making frequent leaps over the Potomac to drink the sound red wine there and breathe the free air. My guess is that the two republics would be getting on pretty amicably. Perhaps they'd have come to terms as early as 1898 and fought the Spanish-American War together. In 1917, the confiding North might have gone out to save the world for democracy, but the South, vaccinated against both Wall Street and the liberal whim-wham, would have kept aloof and maybe rolled up a couple of billions of profit from the Holy Crusade. It would probably be far richer today, independent, than it is with the clutch of the Yankee mortgage shark still on its collar. It would be getting and using his money just the same, but his toll would be less. As things stand, he not only exploits the South economically, he also pollutes and debases it spiritually. It suffers damnably from low wages, but it suffers even more from the Chamber of Commerce metaphysic.
Poppycock. Can you
No doubt the
imagine the
Confederates...
benighted condition of the South today if it did not have access to northern beneficent 50-year mortgages?
I'm just at awe at the Chamber of Commerce metaphysic. That is a lot of practical right-wing strategy, I think, can be summed up in that phrase, the Chamber of Commerce metaphysic.
It is.
No doubt the Confederates... No doubt the Confederates, victorious, would have abolished slavery by the middle 80s. They were headed that way before the war, and the more sagacious of them were all in favor of it. But they were in favor of it on sound economic grounds, and not on the Brummagem moral grounds which persuaded the North. The difference here is immense. In human history, a moral victory is always a disaster, for it debauches and degrades both the victor and the vanquished. The triumph of sin in 1865 would have stimulated and helped to civilize both sides. Today, the way out looks painful and hazardous. Civilization in the United States survives only in the big cities, and many of them, notably Boston and Philadelphia, seem to be sliding down to the cow country level. No doubt, this standardization will go on until a few of the more resolute towns, headed by New York, take to open revolt and try to break out of the Union. Already, indeed, it is talked of. But it will be hard to accomplish, for the tradition that the Union is indissoluble is now firmly established. If it had been broken in 1865, life would be far pleasanter today for every American of any noticeable decency. There are, to be sure, advantages in union for everyone, but it must be manifest that they are greatest for the worst kinds of people. All the benefit that a New Yorker gets out of Kansas is no more than what he might get out of Saskatchewan, the Argentine Pampas, or Siberia. But New York to a Kansan is not only a place where he may get drunk, look at dirty shows, and buy bogus antiques, it is also a place where he may enforce his dunghill ideas upon his betters. Brutal. And if you think that's brutal, I'll just read this next part on page 200 of Class A Blunder, because it's sort of like he sort of sums up the idea nicely here of what he's talking about.
All right.
And this would be originally published 1925, and he says, "The Southern gentry made a capital mistake when they yielded to pressure from the poor white trash, and connived at the disenfranchisement of the colored brother. Had they permitted him to vote, they would have retained political control of all the Southern states, for the black, like the peasant everywhere else, would have followed his natural masters. As it was, control quickly passed to the white trash, who still maintain it, though some of them have ceased to be poor. The gentry now struggle in vain to get back in the saddle. They lack the votes to achieve the business unaided, and the blacks, who were ready to follow them in 1870, have become incurably suspicious of them. The result is that politics in the South remains unfathomably swinish. Every civilized Southerner knows it and is ashamed of it, but the time has apparently passed to do anything about it. To get rid of its demagogues, the South would have to wait until the white trash were themselves civilized. This would be a matter demanding almost as much patience as the long vigil of the Seventh-day Adventists.
One does wonder what Mencken would have made of LBJ's administration and the shift of allegiances that happened there.
Well, it's certainly likely a lot of people listening might be upset at what we're reading, particularly on the last point. If you're from the South, as I am, and you're well aware of the degree of degeneration today, and rule by white trash is exactly how the South works. Um, to some degree, that exists virtually everywhere, including up here in far-flung Montana. Teal deer, without going too long on it. It's basically petite bourgeoisie people with ill intent, no redeeming qualities, and swinish appetites, and nothing but greed and the absolute worst sort of nepotism to fellow white trash in terms of who is actually receives patronage from these people. Truly the absolute scum of the earth, and they have absolutely ruined the South. So it might be irritating to some people to hear whites spoken about in this language about 100 years later after he wrote this. Actually, exactly 100 years after he wrote this. So important to keep that in mind, but also to keep in mind that the situation for whites in general was certainly not as bad as Mencken wrote when he wrote this, but the phenomenon he is talking about absolutely exists and existed at the time and has reached its logical conclusion of the total destruction of the South as a sort of separate political potentiality, in that no matter what were to be done today, and I mean in terms of the complete reversal of all of the tribulations and negative effects we've been through over the last 100 years, there would be absolutely no recovering the Southern aristocracy that he spoke of, because it has been completely obliterated by its own trash elements. It's difficult to describe how much, as a Southerner, one despises the white trash that tends to rule over one. I'll leave it at that.
Indeed, you
Yeah, and I
know
mean that
whereof you
that
speak.
makes. Yeah, and if you remember back when we were talking about Albion Seed back in the first few episodes, we were mildly critical of a lot of like the Southern Tidewater gentry just because that was going against popular memes that the online right had. But if you read back through these last two selections that Mencken collected, he has no illusions that the aristocracy are just pure bastions of moral virtue or what have you, but they at least were a budding aristocracy. Like we said earlier, if you wanted to get an aristocracy back, you can't find one in America. There is no American aristocracy. There are American elites, and they function very similar to what Mencken was describing earlier as like a faux aristocracy. But you can't really create a real aristocracy just at the snap of your fingers. You cannot decide to go out and make yourself an aristocracy. In fact, it would be very unaristocratic for the middle class or a low class person to just go out and declare himself an aristocrat. People have tried that in history, but that's not how aristocracies tend to develop. So that's the thoughts. Also, I originally was hesitant to include this last paragraph, the Class A blunder, but obviously it's here. The decision to include it won out. I think it's very important as well to understand that a lot of like imminent hatred that people might have is not necessarily inevitable. At least that's the idea that he's putting forth here in this whole paragraph. If that was not the case, this paragraph doesn't make any sense.
Mm. On to the revolution, comrades.
All right. Yes, Mr. Quinn, if you can take us from here to our liberated utopia. Actually, it would be historians first.
Oh, historians? Did I miss one?
Page
Okay.
201.
201. Got it. I skipped one. All right. From A Book of Calumny, 1918. It is the misfortune of humanity that its history is chiefly written by third-rate men. The first-rate man seldom has any impulse to record and philosophize. His impulse is to act. Life, to him, is an adventure, not a syllogism or an autopsy. Thus, the writing of history is left mainly to professors, moralists, theorists, dunderheads. Few historians, great or small, have shown any capacity for the affairs they presume to describe and interpret. Gibbon was a glorious failure as a member of Parliament. Thucydides made such a mess of his naval command that he was exiled from Athens for 20 years and finally assassinated. Flavius Josephus, serving as governor of Galilee, lost his whole province to the Romans and had to flee for his life. Mommsen, elected to the Prussian Landtag, became an easy mark for the socialists. How much better would we understand the habits and nature of man if there were more historians like Julius Caesar or even like Niccolo Machiavelli? Remembering the sharp and devastating character of their rough notes, think what marvelous histories Bismarck or Frederick the Great might have written. Such men are privy to the facts. The usual historians have to depend on deductions, rumors, guesses. Again, such men know how to tell the truth, however unpleasant. They are wholly free of that puerile moral obsession which marks the professor. But how seldom it is that they tell it. A nice little rant there.
I think that this is I think it was very important given the topics of American spirits.
Yeah, I mean, he
is,
talks about Caesar there, and Caesar, one of the reasons he's so famous is because he wrote De Bello Gallico, the commentary on the Gallic War, and it's one of the very few instances where we have a serious historical treatment by the protagonist. So it's certainly something I wish there were more of.
Yes,
since that was
and
so.
It's also
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say it's also worth pointing out the implication here is that if we don't have people that were actually there at the time, even though they inevitably sort of over-exaggerate what may have happened, as is common to say about Caesar's accounts of the wars in Gaul, it's at least better than deducing from outside facts what we do not have written at all. That is just completely speculative. We sometimes trick ourselves into saying that it's methodologically rigorous, scientific, or what have you, but just guessing by inference from other things happening in history that this too must have happened is very faulty.
Have you ever read A Crusade in Europe, Ryan?
No, I haven't.
That was Eisenhower's memoir, which I read maybe 25, 30 years ago and have no lasting impression of. But in this vein, I'm inspired to go back and look at it again.
Yeah, that might be worthwhile, especially if we ever decide to tackle World War II.
Dare we?
Alrighty.
All right. Since that was so short, I'll take Revolution as well.
Thank you very much.
Certainly. The Baltimore Evening Sun, 1930. It is the law of political revolution that the actual upset of a government is always preceded by concessions to the malcontent party. So long as Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico like a house of correction, he was perfectly safe. But the moment he released Francisco Madero from jail and began to talk of reforming the judiciary, dividing the big estates, and widening the suffrage, his doom was sealed, and within a year he was a fugitive and Madero was president. So with the Tsar of Russia. He signed his own death warrant when he signed the decree calling the First Duma. Even if a world war had never come, he would have lost his throne inevitably and his head with it. So in many another case, ancient and modern, There has never been a successful revolution out of the clear sky. Always, the doomed despot has prepared for it by making concessions to his enemies. The psychology behind this phenomenon is so simple that even a psychoanalyst should be able to penetrate it. What protects the despot, so long as he lays about him boldly, is the fact that very few men, even among the rebels, have any appreciable courage. Whether physically or morally, they seldom attack a power that can really hurt them and is plainly willing and eager to do so. But the moment that power shows any sign of fading into weakness, they become very daring and are hot for defying it. Next to outright abdication, the chief sign of such a weakening, at least to most men, is a readiness to compromise. They have no belief whatever in the excuses commonly given for it: generosity, a sense of justice, conversion to new ideas, and so on. They always see it, and perhaps quite rightly, as simply a cloak for fear. Thus, the despot who hedges, no matter how exalted his motives may be in his own view, appears to his enemies as one who has lost his grip, and at the first chance they fly at his throat, usually to the tune of loud protestations of altruism. The leaders among them appear suddenly to be full of courage, for courage is always a relative matter, and the man who runs from a lion in full possession of its faculties will pull the tail of a lion down with palsy. Simultaneously, the camp followers and Me Too's, hitherto discreetly silent, begin to beat heroically on washtubs and demand a chance to get at him.
I think that was probably delivered with the exact same idea that Mencken had.
Yep.
And this is actually much more topical than I was expecting it to be, like 3 weeks ago when I just put all these together. Yes, if you compromise with a mob that is violent and explicitly revolutionary in their rhetoric and designs, you shouldn't be surprised at what comes next. And if you still
build
defend,
your own gallows.
yeah, and if you defend the compromiser, you shouldn't be surprised who you end up defending and where that ends up. So it's much more topical than I expected, but very. I sort of going through all the history classes, reading all the books that I have had to read and chosen to read, you find a lot of these cycles or these patterns that Mencken describes, but he describes them so well that it's almost not worth even trying to re-articulate it. Just quote this if you want to
Yes, I
describe
think
the
the
cycle.
audience is perfectly capable of drawing the analogy.
So we have one more, and this actually ended up being much more well-timed than I was worrying about the first few that we started reading. This is New Deal number 1, written in 1934.
Which, of course, is a little more than a year and a half into or about almost 2 years into the Franklin Roosevelt's first administration and the eponymous New Deal number 2.
Yeah, right. And that should be no surprise to anyone that Mencken was like the anti-New Dealer. He was very much against such an idea before it was even thought up by its proponents. So if you like your American 20th century right-wing tradition of being against FDR and everything that he wrought upon the land, this is very much one of the original minds that you have to thank for it, because if not for him and a few other people, there was very little in the way of overt opposition in the papers. So, from the Baltimore Evening Sun, December 31st, 1934. The state of affairs in France in 1845 was a great deal like the state of affairs in the United States in 1928. The country, after some heavy grunting and contriving, had at last recovered from the Napoleonic Wars. There was an immensely stupid but immensely respectable king on the throne. The cabinet, headed by F.P.G. Guizot, was committed to the principle of peace and no reform. Business was good and getting better. The prices of all stocks and bonds were striking new highs. Wages were soaring with them, and the whole landscape seemed to be covered with molasses. The English, glowering across the Channel, and the Germans stealing dark glances over the Rhine, were frankly envious. and it was at this time, I believe, that the latter invented one of the most eloquent of their phrases, Vigot in Frankreich. But in 1847, something slipped, and before the year was out, France was tortured by billions of ants and its pantaloons. No one seemed to know just what had happened. One day, everything was lovely, and the next day, there was a panic on the stock exchange. The shops of Paris were suddenly empty, factories were closing down everywhere, and hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen were out of work. The politicians, of course, all had glib explanations, some saying one thing and some another, and the professors at the Sorbonne issued a great many contradictory graphs and tables of statistics. But the plain people distrusted the former as rogues and the latter as idiots, and in consequence, there was much murmuring in the land. It went on pianissimo for 6 months or so, and then rose unpleasantly to forte, with frequent bursts of sforzando. Simultaneously, a great many new wizards began to rove the country, many of them preaching a novel gospel called socialism, lately invented by a man named Karl Marx. The whole trouble, said these wizards, was due to the rotten rich. France, it appears, was still bursting with wealth, but the rotten rich were hogging all of it. Look at their elegant carriages in the Bois, with red wheels, plate glass doors, and coachmen arrayed like ambassadors. Regard the obscene way in which they drape silks, satins, pearls, rubies, and diamonds upon their wives, daughters, and concubines. Take a peep, monsieur, into the Baroque mansions, and observe the immoral displays of gilt chairs, leopard skin rugs, and the hand-painted oil paintings. Above all, my little rabbit, think of their tight hold upon the docile serf, that false and wicked king Louis Philippe. So, on February 24th, 1848, Louis Philippe was heaved out, and a provisional government was set up in his place. This government, it turned out later, was operated from behind the scenes by professional politicians, but all the plain people could see of it at the start was an impressive brain trust. Then something new in the world. There have been many brain trusts since, and some of them have glittered with genius. But certainly, there has never been another that took the shine off this first one. For it not only included all the political and economic advanced thinkers of the time, from Louis Blanc to Louis Blanqui, and from Jacques Cavaignac to Alexander Ledru-Rollin. It also could show a gifted proletarian metaphysician, Alexander Albert, and a celebrated poet, Alphonse de Lamartine.
If only we had a Frenchman on this stream who could pronounce all these names.
If only. But thankfully, I will always hog all of the essays that we have to read on these streams that have foreign names in them, so I can butcher them in the most extravagant ways possible.
As they deserve.
These talented men proceeded at once to give France a planned economy. The capitalistic system was abolished overnight, and in place of it, there was established a system of shared wealth, not unlike the late Huey Long's. It was ordained that the old inequality between man and woman should cease, and that every freeborn French citizen should have in future not what he could get, but what he yearned for. But where was this money to come from? From the rotten rich, of course. Hadn't they been grinding the faces of the poor since the days of Charlemagne? Weren't they known to be so full of their ill-gotten spoils that their very hides were nigh to bursting? Unfortunately, making them disgorge was not as easy as it looked. Large numbers of them had departed from Palo Alto with Louis Philippe, and many had managed to take their gold and chattels with them. The rest protested that they were broke like everyone else. Their Baroque mansions were boarded up, and their anthropophagous factories were shut down. All through the winter, jobs became scarcer and scarcer. People began to tramp through the streets of Paris demanding bread. The Brain Trust labored day and night on its revolutionary plans to make society over, but even its boldest and most forward-looking devices could not keep pace with the backward slosh of events. Finally, it came out with a new scheme and announced that the problem was solved at last. The trouble hitherto, it explained, had been that the plain people had depended too much on the rotten rich for jobs. Now all that would be done away with. Henceforth, the dishing out of all jobs would be in the hands of the government, which is to say of the brain trust. Public factories would be erected at once, and every workman who wanted to work would be accommodated. There would be no more unpleasant unemployment in France, and the workers, instead of yielding up 99% of the fruits of their labor to capital, would henceforth take all. The erection of these factories was entrusted to a young advanced thinker with the charming name of Marie, and he fell to work furiously. In addition, he prepared to undertake open-air public works on an enormous scale, the construction of 2 huge railway stations in Paris, the dredging of the river Oise, the building of new canals and railways in all directions, and so on. But for some reason undetermined, maybe the secret machinations of the outlawed capitalists, maybe the sinister workings of the law of supply and demand, all the jobs thus made failed to accommodate the hordes of jobless. In fact, their numbers kept on increasing, and soon there were riots in Paris, and M. Marie was out of a job himself, and a bright young professor named Thomas was put in his place. But Professor Thomas came a cropper too, and by the end of 1848, France was in a far worse state than it had been at the beginning of its New Deal. Many members of the original Brain Trust had been sent packing by now, but others always turned up. And these recruits kept on functioning with increasing assiduity as the dismal year wore on. Every day they announced some new and grander scheme to bring in the millennium, and every day they abandoned some busted one. Meanwhile, the plain people went on looking for jobs and not finding them, and the politicians behind the scene waited for their chance. It came in December. Within the space of a few days, they turned the Brain Trust out and made the accommodating Louis Napoleon president of France. At once, the rotten rich began to creep back in, and closed factories began to reopen, and there began to be jobs again. 3 years later, Louis Napoleon became emperor. Some of the details of this story are worth noting. One is that the Brain Trust, despite all its highfalutin pretensions, was never anything save a sort of false face for politicians. They let it rave on so long as the plain people believed in its magic, but when that magic was seen to be bogus by everyone, they emerged from behind the arras and took over their old business at the old stand. Another is that the Brain Trust, though it was made up of the self-confessed first intellects of the time, scored a complete goose egg. Not a single one of its fine schemes to bring in more abundant life really worked. At the end of its operation, all that it had to show was a gigantic public debt, the highest tax rate ever heard of in France, and an almost endless line of unemployed. What this adventure cost the country, first and last, I don't know. But certainly it must have been many millions of francs. Its goat was the French taxpayer. He had to pay in the end for all the crazy buildings of gaudy railway stations, and all that frantic dredging of rivers and digging of canals. Starting out with the thesis that the rotten rich were scoundrels and ought to be squeezed, the Brain Trust proceeded easily to the thesis that any man who had any property whatsoever was a scoundrel, and ought to be squeezed equally. The rich in the main managed to escape, but the little fellow could not get away, and squeezed he surely was. And what became of the Brain Trust when the show was over? It disappeared as mysteriously as it had come together, leaving scarcely a trace. The only genius on its roll who was a man of any actual distinction in the world was the poet, Lamartine. After it blew up, he decided to go in for politics professionally, and in 1849 he ran for president of France against Louis Napoleon. Beaten by millions of votes, he returned to the poetical business, but even at that he could no longer make a living. And in his last days the French government had to put him on the dole. Of such sort were the smart and saucy fellows who undertook, in the France of a century ago, to overthrow the capitalistic system, redistribute the wealth, abolish poverty, and find a job for everyone, and bring in the New Jerusalem. So this is included just for the historical value partly. Also, I can't help but see a lot of this trend in the online right, because a lot of the reaction that you see to the present economic system is not born out of a distinct want for a different sort of system or a different doctrine. A lot of it is just inherently reactionary and out of spite, but usually justified, quite frankly. But what Mencken is pointing out here is that if you just guide yourself by spite economically, which also is very important. I think we said on one of the streams a while ago, you might not care about economics, but it definitely cares about you.
Spite has a tendency to redound upon the face.
Yeah. Yes, that's awesome. So you can advocate very populist economic policies in the modern day if you so want. You can also be informed right now that you did not come up with them, and you are definitely serving some political force by doing so. But it should not be surprising to anybody that at the end of this road, just purely spite-driven economic populism, the only people that can't actually escape from it are the people that you would nominally want to protect, the little people in the country that should be here. So that's like the meta analysis that I wanted to give here.
Indeed.
Any
As
thoughts?
he says, don't be spiteful, don't be a mutant.
Wonderful. All right. I think that is all of the readings on the slate for this week. Mr. Charlemagne, do we have any super chats anywhere?
Unfortunately not. I don't see any in Entropy, and I don't think we've gotten any on YouTube from scrolling up.
Speaking of spite.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Especially with
Yeah,
the
no.
excellent readings from Mr. Quinn. But, oh well.
No,
We're outside of our
miss-
usual time window here, and
Yeah.
Yeah, we are a bit late.
criticism is
So-
never popular, so I wear it as a badge of honor.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
well,
squeeze
on
our
the
goat.
earlier essays, which I didn't comment on, I'll say yes. None of us will ever be aristocrats, so we should just remove that idea from our heads if it's still lingering at all. On the first essay, it was written before perhaps the best example of what he was discussing, which is the way America fought World War II, particularly the way it is celebrated now. I mean, the war is basically like if two wrestlers were grappling each other, and then America came up and started punching one in the kidneys, and then celebrated the great victory. I feel like today, if space aliens invaded Russia with lasers and plasma bombs and stuff, America would join the aliens and then celebrate their great and heroic victory over the Russians. So there's a lot of truth in these criticisms that people should take to heart for sure.
Yeah, that's a wonderful that's a wonderful imagery there. Alrighty. Well, yeah, I'm sorry that this is pushed back an hour, but such is my school schedule.
It's okay. It gave me the time I needed to nap, frankly, because I was only just feeling able to stream until like about when we started, and I've had a bit of tea. My friend Newsfist brought over from England that has perked me up a bit. In time to close the stream, so thank you guys for doing the readings today and the commentary. And I guess we will see everyone next week with more Mencken.
Yep, one more week of Mencken, everybody.